This is an extremely well-behaved audience, I have to say. So thank you all, and we're really privileged now to be joined from Washington by Deputy Secretary of State, Dr. Kurt Campbell. I am confident that historians, when they write about this period of American statecraft, will identify Kurt Campbell as one of the most important figures of all. I say this in part because I've written that in my history already, but it is even more true today than when I wrote it a few years ago in one of my books. I had the real pleasure of working for Kurt in the Clinton administration, in the Pentagon, and then when I went into the Bush administration in the White House, frequently met with Kurt secretly at a Starbucks around the corner. That was before we had flat whites in Washington, and have seen Kurt in action at the White House and the State Department. He is respected by Republican members of Congress as much as he is by Democrats, a truly bipartisan figure who brings to the position a wealth of experience and deep, deep connections to Australia, as you know. So we'll invite Kurt to make some remarks. I will then try to ask him a few embarrassing questions, and looking forward to it. I hope our comms are all set, so let me turn it over. Please welcome Dr. Kurt Campbell.
Mike, thank you so much for those very warm words. I do want you all to know the truth was never that Mike worked for me. Every career has a person that takes an interest in you and supports you. Mike educated me in the fullest sense of the word about the wonders of Asia, about how to think of the Indo-Pacific, and I've been just personally grateful and professionally grateful for the majority of my career. He played bagpipes in my wedding. He taught me how to think about Japan. He helped me understand the history of the American engagement in the Indo-Pacific. And I will say I'm so thrilled that he's had this opportunity at the center, and Australia's done remarkable things there. And I think the task ahead has never been more important, ensuring that we're linked up appropriately between our two countries. Now, I will say we've just come through a remarkable election in the United States. It did not go the way I had hoped, but at the same time, I think we have to fully recognize the will of the American people, and we need to do everything possible, both, Mike, to ensure that we have a successful transition, and then do what we can to underscore what elements of American strategy are working, what needs to be refined going forward. I will simply say I think we have enormous challenges in Europe, in Ukraine. I think the Middle East is enormously difficult at every possible level. But I think one of the things that we've seen, a hallmark of this administration, frankly, building on much of the good work of the Bush administration that first started the Quad, on work that President Obama did with respect to engaging allies and partners, and what President Trump and his team did, frankly, recognizing some of the challenges lurking in China that had to be addressed collectively. I think the hope is that some of what has been established will be continued. And I will simply say this, just sort of in closing. We've had elements and periods of strategic engagement in the Indo-Pacific in which there were schools of thought that were vying for preeminence. There were periods in which the most sophisticated interlocutors believed that a direct diplomacy between the United States and China was central, and that all other relationships had to flow from that central core. There was a small group of people, of which Rich Armitage, Joe Nye, and frankly, Mike Green, probably more than anyone in terms of providing the intellectual framework and the historical knowledge, understood that a better way to think about American strategy in Asia was from the outside in, and focusing more on allies and partners and common purpose therein. And so one of the things I think we've tried to do, building on this historical experience, is focus on both bilateral engagements, deepening those historical ties, often grounded in the 1950s and 1960s, but also seek to innovate with more creative gatherings. AUKUS, the Quad, building on what Mike did when he was a senior director at the White House during the first gathering of the leaders in the aftermath of the tragic tsunami in Indonesia. We've seen a number of initiatives like AUKUS, like the trilateral engagement between the United States, Japan, and South Korea, what I think are innovative partnerships with countries like Vietnam and India. Anyone who argues that the United States has nothing really of value to offer is not paying attention in the technology space. When we put technology initiatives in AI, in quantum, in 5G, in 6G on the table, allies, partners, and other countries listen. So I will say, in terms of the Indo-Pacific, I think we turn over to this administration a relatively strong record. There's much more that needs to be done. We need to work much more with allies and partners on co-production. We need to double down on initiatives like AUKUS, recognizing that hard yards lie ahead. We need to recognize that new innovations, particularly with respect to the Navy, are going to be central. We hopefully will have greater resources to deploy to diplomatic engagements across the Pacific, working closely with partners in Australia and New Zealand. And the hope will be that the United States will resist the temptation to go inward and to put its interests uniquely first, and to recognize that we are stronger working with allies and partners. Frankly, what comforts me and what I'm grateful for in this venue, Mike, no country is better at strategic capture than Australia. And frankly, I watched what Japan did during the first part of the Trump administration, but Australia as well, building deep, resourceful ties that underscored the importance of these bilateral relationships and the work therein. So I would say this is a time right now to be innovative, to be optimistic, to work, to make the argument about why common purpose is in our best interests, and why the United States should not withdraw from the world or from partnerships, to work more closely than ever with Indo-Pacific partners and colleagues. Nowhere is that more important than Australia. I will also say I'm particularly proud of this. I do not believe that the U.S.-Australian relationship has ever been stronger, but frankly, it's gone from strength to strength in every administration, and I'm proud to say that we can turn this pristine, wonderful, strong bilateral relationship that's seeing more and more engagement in people-to-people in military and strategic arenas come to fruition. I think we leave it in a strong place. Mike, I leave it to you, the people in this audience, to help sustain what's working and innovate where necessary. In some circumstances, that means criticizing what comes before, what we did, but ultimately it is about a strengthened partnership, which the United States, frankly, I think is served very well by in terms of its partnership with Canberra. So Mike, I want to congratulate you on the work that you've done down there. This is a great session. I only wish I was there with you. I had planned to be there if there had been a certain different election outcome. I spent a lot of my time doing career counseling and advice and encouragement, but it's still great to be here. I know Mark, Harlan, many of my friends are there. I wish them well, and thank you again for having me. I'm happy to interact, take any hard questions. I prefer the easy ones, but whatever you have. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks so much, Kurt. Thanks for your service and your comments. Thanks for raising the bagpipes. I did play at Kurt's wedding. It was a wonderful wedding. I should now mention that as part of our revenue plan, we do offer discount bagpiping for anyone at this conference. If you need a piper for a wedding or a quad summit or maybe a COP meeting, let me know. Kurt, let me I'm assuming you're going to leave a memo for your successor, transition essay. Maybe you can give us a bit of a hint. You've been associated with some very significant initiatives, obviously Quad and so forth. What are the initiatives that you think your successor, or assuming he's confirmed, Senator Rubio, should be prioritizing with Australia and in the Indo-Pacific? What are 2 or 3 things that you really hope they will pick up and run with?
Well, Mike, thank you for that. So look, I'm very much encouraged. Like you, I have enormous admiration for Senator Rubio. He spoke with Secretary Blinken over the weekend. We've agreed that we're going to exchange engagements. He's quite committed to making sure that there is a lot of interaction. It is a complicated period in that we're very prepared. We've got all our transition spaces and documents, but to date, the Trump team has not signed any of the transition memos, and it's not clear that they will. So it might be that some of this work has to be done informally. For me, I would just offer a few things. Like there are the obvious things like AUKUS, but frankly, most of the hard work, the hard yards, are going to be at the Pentagon. We're largely at the end of the process of getting the appropriate releasability for technologies. And I will say it has not been an easy task, and I give great credit to Ambassador Rudd and the Australian team making the argument, and Deputy Prime Minister Marles, about why, if we're going to do this, we have to trust Australia and make a sort of a single unit for certain kinds of procurement. And we've made enormous progress in that direction. But it's going to need to have continued focus and support. I will say, Mike, much like the 1950s and 60s, when large numbers of U.S. forces for the first time went to Japan, that same experience is going to happen in Australia. We have to make sure that that goes smoothly. We're going to need mechanisms in place. We're going to make sure that our embassy and our consulates are able to support that. So I would like very much to see AUKUS continue to thrive. There are a few voices that have raised questions about AUKUS, but I think most of that, frankly, is contrarian. One of the things, Mike, that I think you know and have seen is there is deep bipartisan engagement on the Pacific. Frankly, probably more in the Republican Party than anywhere else. And so I'm confident that these powerful, purposeful senators and leaders in the House, people like Senator Hagerty, Senator Sullivan, people that are well familiar to you, Senator Young, who is a remarkable champion of technology, Senator Rubio, these people have made a career of advocating for American engagement in the Indo-Pacific. And my hope is their arguments, their persuasiveness, and their perspective will have a big impact on how the administration adjudicates its way forward. So AUKUS would be number one. Mike, I'm quite focused on the Pacific. I would say this is an arena that we have to be aware is highly contested. I think it's the place where we could expect some strategic surprise. China is relentless. They want to build bases. They want to extend their power there. We're going to have to do more, and we have to do more with Australia and New Zealand, recognizing that our role is largely to support Australia. That means more diplomatic engagements, more USAID, more Coast Guard, more Peace Corps. All of those things are going to be important. But Mike, remember, the budget that has been put forward in the House calls for a 50% reduction in our programming in the State Department and USAID. Very hard to compete strategically in that environment. So my hope is that Senator Rubio, the Trump administration, will recognize that this is a moment of acute strategic competition. So I would say resourcing is probably as important as anything else. We're not going to be in a world where we can ask for a lot more, but just containing and sustaining current levels will be important. And then the last thing I would just simply say, Mike, we're working very constructively on technology, on critical minerals, on trace elements that are critical both for clean energy and for technology initiatives. That has to continue. The kinds of work that are being done in technology pockets in Australia have to be encouraged and supported. We are seeing now a much more holistic set of engagements, both in terms of financing and joint development. All of that has to be encouraged. So the agenda is full. I think we have willing and able partners down under. My hope will be that the mantle will be seized and run with by the new Trump team.
I think it's fair to say you've occasionally gotten in a little bit of trouble for being forward-leaning on trade policy and economic statecraft.
Yes.
That's fair, right?
Yes.
And it hasn't deterred you from continuing to push inside the current administration. What do you think the prospects are for a more proactive, I won't say trade policy per se, because trade policy is a complicated political thing, as you know, but what are the prospects for a more proactive approach to economic statecraft in the region? Perhaps, including trade, but more broadly.
Mike, it's a great question and extremely important, and the right question, given how important trade is to Australian and New Zealand friends. So I would simply say the way that you've just characterized it is exactly right. We should be talking about economic and technological statecraft and not using the 5-letter word. And I will say the worst ass chewing I've ever had was in this administration, in the Chief of Staff's office and elsewhere for, allegations that I had been supportive of TPP. And, those are horrible rumors that somehow get started after I go out and say I support TPP. So I would simply say this, Mike, there are a couple of areas that I believe there is bipartisan support for. Let me give you one example. Digital and other forms of electronic commerce are substantially on the rise in the Indo-Pacific. We were this close in IPEF to basically concluding this major chapter when one or two people in USTR and one or two people on the Hill decided that the long-standing practices should be reconsidered. Now, I will tell you this, that I listen to Republicans and Democrats. Everyone believes that finding a way forward on digital agreements makes an enormous amount of sense. And that, contrary to the views of some, digital agreements would serve the interests of small and medium-sized firms. It would lead to the kind of democratization in technology and digital platforms that we all believe in. So that's number one. Number two, Mike, I also think that in a variety of technology exploits that buried or as part of those endeavors are things that look a lot like trade. And so as we work more in AI, in other arenas, that brings our tech and commercial communities ever closer together. I also think the work on critical minerals, when Prime Minister Albanese and President Biden signed the critical minerals agreement, it has led to certain kinds of cooperation that are quite deep. Now, that is based on a free trade agreement between the Australia and the United States, and Wexler, bless her soul, for concluding that. I would say there's ample work to do here. It has to be done carefully, and we need to understand. Mike, you taught me this. We can do a lot of things in the Indo-Pacific. We can have important military engagements, excellent diplomacy. If we're not perceived as an active, engaged, optimistic, open country that welcomes innovation and connectivity, we will not succeed in the Indo-Pacific. And so I'm sorry, I wish that this were not as difficult as it is, but I'm personally not going to stop talking about it just because it's challenging. It's absolutely necessary, and I'm convinced there are bipartisan groupings in the United States that also share this perspective.
One thing we can all look forward to when you're out of government is on the question of trade and economic policy is Kurt Campbell Unbound. So we look forward to hearing you pushing for this more.
Two more months. Yeah.
We had an interesting discussion in the first panel here about how the next administration will or should approach China. You and Jake Sullivan pioneered, before you were in government, this idea of intense competition but with guardrails. What's your advice on how to think about the future of competition? You know, where does it lie appropriately, in your view, between sort of de-risking and decoupling?
So look, I think there will be some inevitable thrashing around in terms of what is the subsequent framework. Mike, you and I are very close friends and have a lot of respect for Matt Pottinger, Representative Gallagher. Their offering was like we should play for victory and not, stalemate or some sort of enduring competition. I think what's important as you look and compare their article and what, frankly, Jake Sullivan and I have done and worked on and written about, if you look at the actual tools of diplomacy and the stated efforts that should be undertaken, they're almost identical. It's just about the end state that we're talking about. I think my own view is to talk about the desire to topple directly the Chinese Communist Party, I think will be destabilizing. I think it would be unwelcome among most of our allies and partners. I think the Chinese would see it as intrinsically destabilizing. And then the common areas where we need to try to find common purpose, I think will become much more difficult. And I would also say at the same time, I think there was a general view that we overestimated our ability to be able to track the trajectory of China's evolution, its progress into the future. I had written another piece with Eli Ratner about whether we had overestimated our ability to track and engage China. I would say the same thing here. I don't think we have the capacity to make these kinds of judgments about what happens inside China. And at the same time, I also believe that we are much better served by trying to weave together countries that accept the shaping qualities of the operating system of the Indo-Pacific, Mike, which you have written about. I will say one last thing, which I don't think people generally like to talk about very much. There is this idea that somehow, absent the Chinese Communist Party, that Chinese diplomacy and efforts would be completely different. But I see some interesting synergies between traditional Chinese nationalism and sort of the Communist Party view of the world that I think are frankly more reinforcing than we'd like to believe. And so I think ultimately we have to deal with the China that we have and construct a diplomacy accordingly. I think the biggest worry is what happens with respect to tariffs. And here, if you're following the news in the United States, and there's no reason you should just focus on other things down there. Because like every morning you force yourself, I'm going to read the newspaper for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to do something else because someone's been nominated or something that just is hard. The truth is they're trying to find a Treasury Secretary who can maintain market confidence, but also is prepared to put huge sanctions on China that would be probably upending in the global economy. So I can't really give you an answer there, but that's the real issue. I will tell you an interesting thing. So President Biden and President Xi met in Latin America for their last meeting. I've been in almost all these meetings. I will say that it has never been a particularly easy relationship. But I could sense, even on both sides, a little bit of nostalgia and a little bit of like what's going to come next. And clearly the Chinese are worried about the possibility of massive sanctions, which could have a real impact, not just on the global economy, but their economy. But what was interesting is now here at the end of this administration, the Chinese are starting to use some of the same frameworks that we use. They're talking about responsible competition that can coexist with certain areas of cooperation. And Xi Jinping actually used in a meeting with President Biden the term guardrails, which is very unusual, which suggests after rejecting that entire approach for 4 years, here at the end, they're starting to understand that there might be something to it.
I mentioned at the beginning of the conference a short story about the early Reagan years. And the first year of the Reagan administration, they debated reestablishing diplomatic relations with Taiwan, so on and so forth. Japan and Australia were actually quite influential behind the scenes in writing the Reagan administration. And that story repeated in different ways for subsequent administrations. One of the things about being an Australian diplomat, as Arthur Sinodinos can tell you, is you don't get to go out and brag about what you just did. And so, as Peter Hartshire pointed out to us, most Australians don't actually realize how much agency Australia, Japan in particular, have in Washington. What would your advice be, finally, for the government in Canberra? How should they approach the new administration in terms of either priorities or philosophy or process?
Look, Mike, I will say this. I had the great fortune to work with Ambassador Sinodinos. I don't know if he's there.
He is.
Tremendously resourceful, effective, modest, capable, working behind the scenes, problem solver, just extraordinary. And so one of the things that we've benefited from, every ambassador from Australia to the United States has had really unusual resources, distinction, and ability to operate without a net. And in many respects, look, Australia has a fine foreign minister, but that foreign minister is often engaged more in the Indo-Pacific. And so in many respects, the Australian ambassador is almost like a foreign minister in his or her realm here in Washington, D.C. So that's going to be enormously important. The one thing I will say, Mike, it is often the case in these circumstances, there's so much that's uncertain. Many countries hold back and wait and hope that maybe if I just stand very still, I won't be noticed. That doesn't work. And frankly, the two countries that have done the best, engaging early, often, and in a determined way, Japan and Australia. Now, the truth is particularly good during the Morrison government, and frankly, Abe was a completely different kettle of fish. We've never seen anyone that determined and innovative. And I could see Prime Minister Shiba realizes how hard it is to replicate that. And it will be difficult. I think the country that's really trying the hardest right now is Great Britain, but getting in, kind of engaging key players. Unfortunately, there probably is a bit of a transactional quality, but at the same time, if it's important, you're going to do what's necessary to make that case. The truth is, for a variety of reasons, the Australia is just very widely admired, not just across the political spectrum, but in virtually every parts of Trump world.
Last question for you, Kurt. You wrote in one of your books that you love the M&Ms at the White House, and I think your book begins with the story of you coming off Air Force One with your pockets stuffed with White House M&Ms, and President Obama hearing the rattling as you walk down the stairs.
I'll tell the story. You're ruining it.
Okay, go ahead.
It's a great.
You do it.
All right. So I was at the State Department, and I'd worked on the opening to Burma. And, government, there are these moments, like government is hard, and there are lots of times of like indignity and it doesn't work. I will say, Mike and I told you this story when we did the Trilateral Summit at Camp David. I was in the cart that was going down the hill to meet nice thing that the president gave the Marine One helicopters to the Japanese and the Koreans to land at Camp David. And so I was coming through the trees, And as the steps down, the very distinguished senior Japanese delegation was coming down the steps, and they didn't think any of us saw them. So they're doing these leaping high fives because they're so excited to be there. And it was just this wonderful feeling. So earlier, I'd worked at much happier moment. I'd worked on the opening to Myanmar, to Burma, and I'd worked really hard, took a lot of risks, a lot of questions, like, should we do this? And we had the opening. Aung San Suu Kyi was out of prison. She joined the government, and it was just an incredible thing. Secretary Clinton went, and then in the last couple of weeks of the first term, President Obama went. And during those points, there wasn't as much like warmth and synergy between the State Department and the White House. We worked together, but it was not. And I remember Secretary Clinton, Jake Sullivan, and I were invited on Air Force One to go to that opening. And so we were in Thailand, we had a meeting in Thailand, and then we woke up that next morning and flew to Naypyidaw. I'm sorry, this is a long story, but it's super funny. So we're on the airplane. I'm like, this is unbelievable. Like, I just, like, we're going to the opening. I'd worked on it. I was just super excited about it. And I hadn't seen Air Force One. Like I'm busy doing other stuff. So I'm on the airplane, and I realized there's some pretty cool stuff on this airplane. And so Mike says M&Ms. I did not steal M&Ms. I stole a White House stapler, a fire extinguisher. I'm not kidding. A flashlight, a White House flashlight that I found underneath the sink. And so I took an ashtray. I had like 30 things, and I had stuffed them in my suit because this was going to be it. I was going to go, but I wasn't going to do anything. And I was just going to put it in my luggage and then give it to my aunt and stuff because show that I'd been on Air Force One. So we land at the airport, and we've got 1 million people there. And I am, of course, in van 700, which is at the very end. And so Mike knows when you get off the airplane, you go off the back of Air Force One, you got to run to your car because when the president leaves and the motorcade leaves, that's it. And so I got all my stuff. I got off the back of the airplane, and I'm basically running to my car, which is in the distance. It's 140 degrees. I've never sweated more. My sweat was sweating through my entire suit, and I'm running, and I realize that there are 2 Secret Service guys behind me. And I went to Catholic school, and I knew I made a mistake. And so I'm starting to serpentine, throwing stuff like they're not going to catch me with any of this stuff. So I'm discarding it, and they're running after me, and I'm running even faster. Finally, they catch up to me. This is all true. And they're exhausted. They're like, buddy, slow down. And I was like, look, I was taking it for a friend. And they go, no. President Obama wants you to ride in the limo with him into Naypyidaw, into Rangoon. So I collect all the stuff. I go back to the car. I've never perspired more in my entire life. I get into the car. I'm just a mess. And the President Obama is cooler than the other side of the pillow. And so we start driving in. He goes, okay, brief me. And so we're driving in. They're 10 deep people along the street greeting. It's just an incredible, wonderful experience. And so I'm telling the history, the Second World War, how the Burmese nationalism. And we drive by Shwedagon Temple, the beautiful, most lovely tribute to Buddhism in Southeast Asia. Solid gold raising into the sun, magnificent. And so I say to President Obama, I go, well, and President Obama, if you look here over to your left, you'll see Shwedagon Temple. No visit to Burma is complete without a visit to Shwedagon Temple. And he goes, God damn it, I knew we should go there. And everyone in the car looks at me because they had decided it was too much of a security threat. We could not go. So we did an audible and we went there. Those guys were so mad at me that we stopped there. But the president had a wonderful visit. He had a blessing. We had a great visit. It was a better day in American diplomacy. And I still have that stapler on my desk.
Awesome.
Thank you, Mike. All the best, okay?
You'll be welcome here, as you know, anytime. Thanks so much, Kurt.
Thank you, Mike.